and that would be kind of entertainingly cruel to appeal to a pretty perhaps my darker side, but people are still coming, so but we've got a really exciting panel for you tonight. In fact, we're currently missing one person, missing Snigdha. I don't know where she is, but hopefully she'll show up, and if not, then the three people I do have for you have plenty to say, so never fear, we're going to be absolutely fine, I can assure you of that. And I'm never quite sure when to begin, because there's a number of people who sign up, and then there's a number who watch on Facebook, and the number it says at the bottom of my screen never seems to actually correlate to how many watch it. I don't know when that number has stopped going up, maybe we just begin. I'm going to start. Is that okay, Anita?
Sure, go for it.
Let's go. Cool. Well, welcome to tonight's Open Democracy live discussion. I'm Adam Ramsay. I'm an editor at Open Democracy, and tonight, in the kind of shadow of COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, we're going to talk about the future of the climate justice movement. And I've kind of pulled together a group of people who I thought would be fascinating on that subject. We've got two people from the UK and two from other parts of the world, although sadly maybe she's just joined us. We have Snigdha. Great. Well, so from the UK we've got Amelia Womack, who is in Wales, who's deputy leader of the Green Party of England in Wales. We've got Nick Dearden, who is the director of Global Justice Now in Botswana. We've got Tracy Sonny from the Climate Justice. I keep getting this wrong, Tracy. You're going to have to correct me. It's not the Climate Justice Movement, it's the Climate Justice Alliance.
The Botswana Climate Change Network.
Climate Change Network. There we go. I got all the words wrong. That's great. Thank you very much. And we've got Snigdha. And Snigdha, you're in Northern India. Where exactly are you right now? Oh, I think you're muted.
Hello. Hi. Yeah. So I'm so sorry I joined a little bit late.
Okay.
I'm currently in Nainital, which is in Uttarakhand, which is in like the north of India. So I'm placed there right now.
Great. And you are a lawyer and you work on climate justice and LGBT rights and women's rights. And you
right.
And you were all 2 weeks ago in Glasgow at COP, doing a whole range of things there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start actually with you, Snigdha, because we're chatting already. And before we get to COP, can you just give me a bit of like a quick explanation of your work on climate change, what it is you're doing, kind of how you ended up going to the UN Climate Change Conference? And then we're going to ask Tracy the same, and then we're going to all talk about our experiences at COP. And then we're going to talk about what next.
Okay, thank you so much. First for organizing this and inviting all of us. So my work here in India is not just based only on climate justice, but also regarding alongside of the social justice movement that we are part of. I started activism quite early in my life when I was in school, then in college, with health rights movements, with reproductive rights movement. And soon afterwards, I joined the Green political party here, and I became active with them in their political campaigns. I was graduating from a law school back then. And so I had constantly, I was involved in doing a lot of internships with NGOs and like in slum areas, in other places where I felt there is a need for us to empower more people. We need to introduce rights-based approach in the society, in community, especially inspire them to fight for the rights. Because in India, we see the groups who are coming from a very vulnerable class or minorities or those who are socially backward, they face a lot of struggle around that. So that started from there, and my constant involvement with Greens in India led me to participate in the first Congress, which I attended. For me, it was the first Congress in 2017 at Liverpool, where that was my first international understanding of how Greens are working globally. And then I started working with Asian Pacific Green Federation as a counselor from India. And then later on, I became a co-convener of Asian Pacific Green Federation. We revived the Young Asian Pacific Young Greens Federation. And then now I'm part of Global Greens. And I was in their delegation.
And you work as a lawyer, as I understand it. You've been very involved in working with people kind of defending forests in Northern India, is that right?
Yes. I did. If I talk more about my work as a lawyer, I have done a lot of cases for acid attack survivors. We have, unfortunately, we have such cases here. And the way I look at it is not just from the angle of what goes in the criminal court, but I want to seek proper rehabilitation. My aim is to mainstream all those acid attack survivors who are like 99% women in India. And so my efforts are to mainstream them, to rehabilitate them, to make like government give them employment and like medical facilities and everything. So this was one with women around forest. We did like I did an active litigation for against hydropower projects, big hydropower projects which are running in India. There was a recent flood event which took place in 7th of February of this year, which took a life of more than 204 people who were basically laborers and who were natives of that place who also have indigenous people in them. And those people died because there was this glacier lake that turned into a flash flood. And this glacier break was all because these activists and villagers, they were fighting in that particular village since very long against hydropower project, but the government did not hear them. The government did not even hear the experts, and we are building these big hydropower projects very next to the glaciers because there we get the highest flow and it is suited for them for their project. So I filed a public interest litigation for them. We were seeking compensation for these families, proper rehabilitation for their children, because all these come from very, very poor backgrounds. So here we can actually see the brunt of climate change. Impetus for these things are the policy, the developmental policies of the government. And then that is falling on the poor people, the marginalized people, women and children and indigenous people. So one of the other things that we are asking on that petition, which is still ongoing in High Court, is that we don't need such projects, and you need to have an expert committee who should either stop sustainable removal of such big dams from upper reaches in the paraglacial zones or in upper reaches of all the rivers across Uttarakhand. Uttarakhand is a Himalayan state in India. So we are just trying to preserve Himalayas and the biodiversities around that and our rivers.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for telling us about that. And sort of, fascinating to hear about the way that, I suppose, the kind of right in the north of India, up by the Himalayas, you're having, massive impact of climate change, but also things like mega dams, which are often mooted as solutions to climate change, cause massive problems too. Tracy, you're in Botswana. And when we met on the train from Edinburgh to Glasgow, and you told me about your incredibly inspiring work fighting the oil industry in Botswana. And so if you could just tell everyone about that first, and then we're going to come to all of our activities together in Glasgow.
Yes, thank you very much, Adam. I'm based in Botswana. I'm the National Coordinator of Botswana Climate Change Network. It's an organization that we started conceptualized it in 2011 after COP in Dearden, and we have been following the COP, the climate change negotiations ever since. And our work actually, it centers around, of course, we look at what is happening at what is developing policy-wise within the negotiations, and then we translate that into action at the national level. There's a lot that we usually link. We even link to the SDGs. Climate justice, it's very, very one critical area that we have over the years, we have realized we need to really push our work around climate justice. Hence, I sit in the board, it's a continental board for the Pan-Africa Climate Justice Alliance in Nairobi. And we have been doing quite a lot, interacting with different like-minded activists, both in developing and developed countries, trying to see how we can push forward the agenda on climate change, how we can better improve, how we respond to climate change at the national level and globally. And most importantly, how can we ensure that the marginalized and those who are feeling the impact can really benefit. We don't want to be attending these meetings and sitting down, spending 2 weeks, but at the end not having anything concrete coming up. But also at the same time, it should be us, when we go there, it should be us who push also at the same time. If we are not seeing any action taking place, if we are not seeing progress in the negotiations, it should be us who are the activists, who should take, the first step and try to push our leaders and say, no, we should take this direction. And I actually want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss and to share my thoughts and also what we are doing at the national level. I think as we discuss some more, I'll share with you, but we are also, we have been doing quite a lot, let me just say that, but our focus also has shifted. We have shifted also to fossil fuels. We've been doing quite a lot on that. We bring in that climate justice aspect into our campaigns at the national level on fossil, and this is one area that has really sparked, the interest even globally. Especially for the climate activists. And adaptation, which I know, when we talk of Africa, we talk of adaptation. So that's one topic I would really stress on as we discuss going forward. Thank you, Adam, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion with everyone here.
And thank you, Tracy. And there was one particular campaign you were telling me about that I think you would love to hear about, which was the Canadian oil company who are moving into Southern Africa and trying to drill up a bunch of your reserves.
Yes, this is what interesting. Like I mentioned, we are trying to shift, to clean and renewable energies, but then we still have experiencing this pushback, especially from those with interest, to continue investing in fossil fuels. And of course, when you come to developed countries, take for our country, for example, they will tell you of stranded assets, and they'll continue issuing licenses because they feel they need to develop the same way the North developed using the fossil. Why should they leave their oil in the ground? But then we have to look at different things, as we try to invest in this. Similarly to, as we, talk of renewables, and we know there are some human rights violations that may come with renewable developments, especially when you look into hydro and big renewable projects. The Okavango is has a very fragile ecosystem. That's a delta, and it supports, close to 40 villages and about more than 15 tribes. We sit within the Okavango Delta. And then all of this, almost everyone in the Delta, they depend on the Delta for their livelihoods. They fish in the Delta, their food, everything in the Delta. And then you have the tourism sector, actually, which also depends much more on the Delta, which also, when you look at our economy as a country, we depend, the tourism sector actually contributes quite a lot to our GDP. So we need to weigh things, Of course, we want to develop using fossil, but what are the implications? What are the long-term implications on the Delta? What are we saying to human rights violations that are happening maybe in Namibia? And this is going to trickle down to Botswana at the same time. What are we saying about that? And the most worrying part is we sit down in the negotiations and we say, we want to push back on fossil. Developed countries, we shouldn't invest, but we are having more developed countries coming in, companies coming from, from the North, coming to invest in Africa. Coal, they invest, oil, they're doing that. And even if now, when you try to trace how much the communities are actually benefiting, there's nothing that they're benefiting from all these developments, and it's where we are saying, you are damaging the environment, and then you go back. You give the communities false hope that they'll benefit from such developments, but at the same time, there are no developments, no benefits that are coming down to the communities. So there are a lot of human rights violations that are taking place that needs to be looked into. And when we now look into the whole overall climate justice issue, it's where we need to put our heads together. Usually our tactics, how we do it, we sit down, negotiate with our governments, talk to our governments, explore what are the best possible ways. If we are to say we diversify our economy, what is the best possible way to do it without violating the rights of the people, the rights of the communities that are in there? I think, Adam, I have that's all I can say for now.
No, and I think it's a very familiar story, that we see at COP on the one hand, all this discussion of phasing down, phasing out fossil fuels and so on. But in reality, in Southern Africa, you've got fossil fuel companies digging out new oil wells, prospecting for new oil, and destroying local communities, environments and rights and economies at the same time. Nick, you're in a sense, I don't want to use the word veteran, you're not that old, but you've been around global justice and environmental justice campaigning for a long time. You've spent not the last 2 weeks, we spent 2 weeks in Glasgow, or a lot of time in Glasgow, kind of around a lot of the campaigning that was going on there. How are you feeling about the climate justice movement and its kind of global strength coming out of the conference?
Well, funnily enough, I felt really old when I was actually up on the streets of Glasgow in many days, because the climate justice movement was so young, so vibrant, so angry, so passionate. And we met, I think, in a cafe a couple of days in, and I just said, I am actually really hopeful, despite the criticisms that we make about what's going on in the negotiations themselves, and the utter failure of world leaders, particularly from wealthy countries, to do what is needed at this moment. And that, that's a given, I'm sure, on this call. Despite that, I actually came away feeling quite optimistic, and I felt optimistic precisely because, I thought back to Paris, right? So some of us 6 years ago were in Paris at the last really big COP staging post, if you like, and I remember endless media around, does climate change even exist? Is it being driven by human beings? That was the discourse at that point. And an awful lot of environmental groups there trying to tell us that the answer was to change our lifestyles a little bit. Now, there was hardly any of that in COP. The climate deniers argument was completely dead. It was just nowhere, really. And this idea that, if we put, renewable light bulbs in and whatever, and do more of our recycling, everything's going to be okay, also wasn't there. What I saw was a movement that had been completely convinced by the idea that this requires major system change, that unless we fundamentally change the rules of the global economy, which is not just a neoliberal fundamentalist free market economy that's driving climate change, but is also deeply colonial, because the roots of this crisis are in colonialism and the exploitation and extraction of big business and wealthy governments from other parts of the world. Unless we change that fundamentally, we will not be able to deal with this crisis at all. And by the way, as Tracy said there, I think some of this applies equally to the renewable economy, right? If we want to build a renewable economy, that cannot just be us here in the global north replacing all our combustion engine cars with electric cars, because those electric cars also rely on metals that are being extracted and exploited from the global south. They perpetuate those relationships, and that's not fair, and is not going to be a sustainable way of getting out. Because why would people in those countries that we're extracting for saying, okay, we'll phase out our fossil fuels, even though half our country doesn't have proper access to energy, while you take all of our minerals and metals in order to fuel your so-called environmental revolution. And what I saw, and I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists say about it, is a movement completely convinced of that. The idea, climate justice has become mainstream, if you like. And even within the conference, you know, the world leaders who did nothing like as much as we would like were actually paying lip service in a way to that. I mean, even massive climate deniers like Bolsonaro were actually pretending he's a great friend of the Amazon. You know, Rishi Sunak, an ultra-free marketeer, was pretending he was going to rewire the entire global financial system. And so, you know, while their actions are nowhere near where we need them to be, we are now, I believe, controlling the narrative on climate change. I think it's fundamentally changed. And I think, you know, absolute, you know, hats off to everybody who's been part of making that happen over the last 5-6 years, because it's really phenomenal. And it gives me hope that we can, you know, although everything we're doing is too late now, and that goes without saying, and there's going to be massive loss of life and suffering and so on. Nonetheless, at least I can see a future wherein there is the push, the drive, and the determination from the movement to create a very different world, and that's what we need.
Thanks, Nick. And Amelia, you were in Glasgow for 2 weeks, and you know, I saw you while you were up in Scotland. How are you feeling after COP? And what was your, you know, do you have a similar experience to Nick, or, you know, what would you like to tell us about your time there? And you're currently muted.
Quite a similar experience to Nick, because I think that I saw a very inspiring journalist write that the era of climate denial is over. I believe that was you, Adam, which I have been saying time and time again. But one thing that I think we need to remember is, yes, maybe the era of climate denial is over, at least in lip service, if not in action, is that what we see across the world right now is that rights hard won are being undermined, whether that's LGBTIQA plus rights or women's rights. And even if we have had that small win, that we need to not rest on our laurels. The fight does continue. It does continue on ensuring that we're challenging the structural issues that are creating the climate emergency, challenging the idea that we can buy our way out of the climate emergency, that, you know, I've been using a reusable bottle for 20 years, not the same one, admittedly. And the climate change isn't solved. My individual action was never going to change anything. And I think the one thing that I would take away from COP is an international perspective, and the fact that here in the UK, too often I feel that politicians talk about the climate emergency as if it's something in the future. But here are people who are living the climate emergency, whether that's the woman from the Philippines that I spoke to, who on her islands, as a result of a super typhoon, tens of thousands, so some reports say 4,000 people, other people say 15,000 people were killed, but they reckon that possibly around 10,000 people were killed. And she was isolated on her island, having to pull food out of the sea, which was the same ocean that had the dead bodies floating in it from the typhoon. And these are real people, real stories that are being ignored and sidelined by governments around the world, but especially here in the UK, as we talk about the climate emergency as if it's some far off problem rather than people's lived experiences right now. And I think what really came out as well for me was the intersectional aspects, the women's rights and women's campaigning, and the different experiences that people have as a result of the marginalization that we have in society. So if you're going to watch anything from COP, I would say the most inspiring point was the People's Plenary, where you heard from Indigenous people, from the trade unions, from women, from rural workers, people who are so often forgotten by the decisions made by governments, given a platform and a voice. And so we could hear the contradictions of what governments were saying and people's real life experiences, because there is a massive gap. I mean, just, you know, Snigdha's experience in India, there's a massive gap between what Modi is saying and her lived experience. With the people, the Indigenous people in Canada see Trudeau standing up like he's going to be the savior of the climate, putting Canada at the forefront of that while their land is being destroyed for fossil fuel extraction. The Indigenous women in Ecuador who went up, saw their leader and went up to him and said, you need to not dig for oil in this site that's a pristine habitat, one of the last areas of pristine biodiversity in the world. And given that it would only last the world oil reserves 2 weeks, it's not worth the impact on our community and the environment for it. And they couldn't get a promise for that, despite the fact that they were walking into negotiations on platforms where they were making those promises. So for me, the reality is what really struck me about COP. The reality of the stories often not told, the reality of the gap between lived experience and what politicians and even the media are saying, and the reality that change needs to be urgent, and we need to be working on an international basis for, well, a feminist climate justice, LGBT climate justice, workers' climate justice. We need to be ensuring that we are addressing all of these issues and ensuring that we are working to lift up those voices that are too often marginalized.
Thanks, Amelia. And we've got lots and lots of people writing in from the audience, and please keep doing that. And I'm delighted to see we've got people all around the world. We've got people writing from Zambia and from Italy and from Botswana and here in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK. And more and more. One question, the first one I've got here is specifically for Snigdha. I think it's a really interesting one, so I'm going to put it to you, which is that, you know, in India in the last year or so, we've seen one of the biggest protest movements in human history against kind of agricultural reform measures that the Modi government were trying to push through. And as I understand it, I've not followed this closely. I'm not by any means an expert in this area, but the Modi government has backed down to some extent in the last week. And I was wondering if you could just tell us about the relationship between kind of those reforms and that social movement against them and environmental and climate justice movements in India and how those issues are connected.
Okay. Yeah, it is indeed a good question, whoever posted that question on the group. So there was a big farmers movement going in India against 3 farm laws, which were completely, if I summarize the farm laws, making it like a system that we have in US, where the farmers are exploited, they're not secured, and it's more of a corporate farming system, which which India and the farmers in India don't want. We do not have anything yet around the minimum price support for farmers if they're for their crop price, but the government was pushing forth, and they've managed to pass those 3 black laws, as they are known in India, to the farmers and all those who supported those movements. The kind of regime that we have, and I'm very conscious, and I'm very very aware that I'm using the word regime for a democratically elected government. But it was very against people. The farmers movement, and like any other movements in India, faced very harsh repression by the state, and many people were jailed. There were planned events of violence planted between these movements to somehow defame them and say these are not the peaceful protesters, these are just miscreants who are trying to create all these like some sort of disruption in the proper functioning, like in the work of the proper functioning government. So this, and see, all these things are very interrelated. We need to see it holistically. When farmers are traditionally farming in their land, they're using their own traditional seeds, they're using their own manure, which they make from here in India. We use different animal dung and all those things. So that is more sustainable, and that is how the environment, like that is how in India, in rural India, in like very remote India, the environment and the climate and the weather has been sustained well so far, because we did not let that corporate farming, pierce its weight inside the system. So that also resulted, and then around, but but that is like, the farmers movement and all these movements, like the farmers movement, we all were totally in support of that movement, because we realized how important it is for the food security in India, how important it is for the land in which we do agriculture, how important it is for the quality of the soil that we are using, the food that we will eat, because we can't stop interlinking all these things in nature, because everything is interconnected. And ultimately, it won't just harm humans who are dependent on those farm produce, but it will also harm those living biodiversity around that land. So we all were in support of that movement. We all organized protests in wherever we are. And similarly, when we did movement against for example, we have this denotification of like in India, the government has denotified many sanctuaries and many such protected areas to allow construction, to allow mining, not just of coal, but in a state of diamonds, and in rich forest cover. So for all these areas, when we started protest, when our partners started to protest, then they all came in support of that, because somehow we are realizing that all these fights are in all these people who are fighting on different issues. We need to see it as all interrelated, and we have to support each other, and we have to give support to it as a whole. So it came out well, but the kind of and recently government took back those 3 laws, and all of us celebrated that because it was so required for them to take. But that shows to us as a victory of people's movement. And now we are hopeful that many other movements that are still ongoing in country, in states, that will also see the same future if we all unite and organize like that.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Snigdha. We've got a few more questions. I'm going to read out one from Anthony Barnett, who's one of the founders of Open Democracy, who is asking essentially about, if the climate justice movement is different and has changed over the last few years, what role has COVID had in that? So he says, if there is a new planetary consciousness, especially across younger generations, has COVID reinforced or influenced that in any way? And how does health relate to intersectionality, and how does our maybe changing understanding of global health relate to the climate crisis? I'd also like to get your thoughts on another question from Doreen Hoskins, who says she's in rural France without any local environmental groups. And what can she do to get involved in the kind of global climate justice movement? And I suppose that's in a way a universal question, which is we're all quite disconnected in many ways. How is it that we can actively, organize politically to change the global systems, which can often seem a long way away? It's kind of, the thing about the consumer action, which Nick and Amelia, I think, rightly criticized, is it's a thing you can do. So how can you actively take part in changing big, complex global systems? And I'm just going to go down all of you to talk about and give us your thoughts on those 2 questions. And maybe we'll start with Tracy, and then we'll come to Amelia and then Snigdha. So Tracy, has COVID helped reframe thinking around climate globally? Do you think it helped us to think more globally? And also, what can people do to get involved in a kind of global movement when that seems so far away from their daily lived existence? And you're muted.
Yes, you can easily forget the speakers. I think for let me start with COVID. We earlier about just before COP, we held also a sort of a panel with the university there in Glasgow, looking at our topic. We actually looked at COVID and climate justice. And one thing that I liked about, of course, COVID it's something else, but what COVID showed us was, the urgency, the need to work together. And the way we responded globally and, cooperating, and even for, our government at the government level, and even as individuals, we responded so very well. And, understanding the implications of COVID, especially when you look at Botswana, it's a small population. It has a small population, and everyone was scared that this can wipe out the whole population. 2.5 million people can be gone anytime. So the way we cooperated, the way we worked together, the way we strategized on how to tackle the pandemic. And, there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from that. And unfortunately, with what just happened at COP, I realize, and I know most of the people who were at COP, they realize that, it will take time, with all the hurricanes and all the flooding that we are seeing, the heat waves, still people don't see the urgency to respond to climate change. We would expect that the way we responded to COVID, it should have changed our mindset. Unfortunately, something it's not adding up, and like we said, someone said, the colonial mindset, it's still, there's a lot that is still embedded, especially when we come to climate change, the political aspect of it, the political arm, and I'll take it again to the fossil issue, the political arm within or on the way we respond. So the COVID-19 pandemic was so bad and people managed to respond, but it shows that we are not really, I think we are not, there's a bit of disconnect between science and what we believe, especially when it comes to climate change. There are a lot of climate deniers, and that's very worrying. And we would have expected to see people, respond in the same way. And like I said, the way countries coordinated, around mobilizing funding, mobilizing vaccines, and even at the national level, the way even government tried to change our mindset. We had campaigns on COVID, and everywhere you turned, it was COVID, and people felt it, and they responded quickly. But what just happened in Glasgow, it shows us there's a lot that we need to do. And like I said, there's a lot of disconnect between the political environment that surrounds the COP negotiations, and then you take it to actually the work on the ground or how to respond to climate change. So I'm really, I can't say COVID has really changed our mindset on how we respond to this. So it's where we still, wonder, are people not really trusting science? Even what we are seeing, we can see the impact firsthand. Right now I'm sitting in almost 40 degrees. It's 40 degrees and it's about it's almost 8 p.m. But it's so hot. We're already seeing it, we are feeling it, but there is no urgency to it. People are not even responding to it. So we would have expected to see a lot of, or a bit of, edge, especially on how we protect our environment. And when now you look at economic recovery, most governments are now going, they're taking on some drastic, they're even going for, developments that are damaging to the environment. And like I already said, you take fossil, they're investing more on that. And you have countries like China, which is still saying, I want to buy more coal, bring it on. Even India, before they had gone quiet, but now they have started. And coal from Africa is going to be exported to some of these countries. So the change, the mindset, there's a lot that we need to do. And the disconnect also between what is happening. You take the rural communities. I saw someone from France who was mentioning that. We also have that marginalization, and we have been trying as an organization to see how can we translate climate science to much more, language that can be understood by the indigenous communities, by those who don't understand or who are not well learned to understand it. And there's a big gap, between those, especially in the urban and the rural. There's a big urban-rural divide. And it's important to have a sort of a holistic approach, try to decentralize, not only sit in the urban areas and only communicate with those in the urban areas, but see how you can take down the information to those at the grassroots level. And it takes time. It cannot happen overnight. It takes time. And it's where you need to understand the communities, that the grassroots communities, understand them, and you sit and understand their issues, and also they hold a lot of vast knowledge which we can use to respond to climate change, the indigenous knowledge that we can take and build, as we continue negotiating at the COPs, at least at the national level, we can have some sort of response action at like that. But it's where you need to learn, try to understand your communities at that rural level and see how you can then package your strategies and see how you can, especially communicate the language, communicate climate science, make it simple for them. Use different methods to communicate and also, just try to unpack it further. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Tracy. That's some great advice. Maybe we'll go to, I said Amelia next, didn't I? So Amelia, we had 2 questions. Feel free to take both or either and in whichever order you prefer. Do you want me to repeat them or do you remember what they are?
Oh, no, I'm good. I think at the start of lockdown, a piece of graffiti emerged in Hong Kong that read, "We can't return to normal because the normal we had was precisely the problem." And I think that was how people felt at the start of lockdown. There was a lot, I feel like we've forgotten those early days where people were thinking very differently about how the world worked and operated, and thinking a lot more about the bigger picture. Here in the UK, we talked a lot about build back better because of the very fact that the normal of before was the problem. And that better was about the environment. The better was about addressing inequality while staying below 1.5 degrees of warming and tackling the ecological emergency. I think that we understood how our world was connected in a much better way, that the fact that we were going further and deeper into areas that we hadn't been before was potentially going to bring out other pandemics, or the way that we use our agriculture can create other situations where viruses like this could spread around the world. So I think that something did change, and I actually feel like we have forgotten those early days of hope, of feeling like things can change overnight, because they did. I actually locked down early, and I feel like this is possibly like my plastic water bottle. I locked down early, but me not going to the pub wasn't going to be the way that we were going to solve the pandemic. The only way we could reduce the impact of the pandemic was to ensure that there was policy put forward by government that meant that we were reducing the spread of coronavirus. And it's the exact same thing with the environment. These big ideas can happen, but they won't be because of individuals doing them. They'll be because government has set the framework that means, quite simply, that the greenest option is the cheapest and easiest option and becomes the entire framework in which we operate in. And so people's consciousness did change, because overnight it is possible for governments to make a difference. When there is an emergency, we can take clear action that recognises the risk that we were in, not just here in the UK, but the international risk as well. And I think that is a powerful memory to keep. As I said, I feel like there are 2 COPs, quite a good reflection for the 2 conversations that have been happening. The difference between adaptation and the difference between taking action right now so that we don't need to adapt in the same way. And I feel like we've possibly moved with COVID, we've possibly moved into that area of, we just need to adapt. But that doesn't mean that we are able to change anything, because we're not tackling the issue at its source. And so I hope that even at this stage, where feelings and ideas, I feel, aren't swelling in quite the way they were in the beginning of lockdown, that maybe we can learn from even this strange interim stage we seem to be at here in the UK, at least, that really we need to be taking action so that adaptation isn't an inevitable point of our future. Oh, and in terms of working internationally, I think it's just one thing I've really felt about COP is that listening to international voices, and I think that even in place, everything we need to be doing to lift those voices up. I think everybody has a role of sharing those stories on social media, on Twitter, making sure that we are following and retweeting and sharing the stories of diverse people on the front lines. And so even if you are so remote, you can't connect with Zoom and into these movements that are happening, you can use your platform and power to ensure that those people who are least represented are heard on a bigger scale.
Thank you, Amelia. And let's go to Snigdha next and then come to Nick. And so, yeah, thoughts on COVID and, and climate change, and also on how to get involved in changing global systems.
So the first thought that comes to my mind every time I think about COVID is that it is a very best and very apparent example of how global crisis knows no borders. So it will pierce through all the borders, and it requires global actions. I have mixed input out of this pandemic. It was not all positive, as like the previous speaker spoke about, but because I felt this inequality when I was applying for COP. In our delegation, there were two people, one from Burundi, other one from Rwanda, who could not even come to COP because there is inequality in vaccine distribution. I also felt earlier, during 2022, there was a lot of isolation. Countries are isolating themselves. In not just countries, even states within countries are isolating themselves. They want to use their resources for the people who are there and serve to them. But instead of that, the approach even back in 2020 should have been like cooperating, sharing knowledge, sharing experience. So that was a really harsh reality that struck us, and that isolation, that extra barrier, that inequality in vaccine distribution we are still facing all across. Earlier we just the people from the global south used to have difficulties in reaching global north for events like COP only on the basis of visas, but now we have additional vaccine restrictions like that goes around. The positive thing out of the pandemic that we now know is we understand these crises very well, because it came to our own house. When our own people got infected by COVID, we understood that if we are going to deforest more, we are going to encroach environment like that, we are going to give birth to more such diseases. So that was a very positive impact of COVID, because that reached individual household, that reached individuals. Those individuals who may not be well aware of some all these climate crises, even in their own countries, even in their own states, because they have more issues regarding food security, employment, and other such burning things that comes right in front of them before the climate crisis. But then they also felt there's something wrong is happening, and that wrong is not done by them. That wrong is done by something else, and they are the ones who are with them facing the consequence of it. So that was a very positive impact of COVID. And that is what I see, not just in India, but also in other countries. When I was meeting delegates from all across the world in Glasgow, I saw that very positive fire in them to fight, to understand, okay, those in power, they are still being still promoting inequality in every ways. Those in power are still lacking ambition to save this planet. But now we understand that we have to take this charge, because we are losing our people. We are losing our relatives, we are losing our family members. And that fire was there when people were marching on the street. That fire was there when the observers in the blue zones were doing activism, creating noise for those who are on street, creating noise for those who are in their communities, and for those who are in different places. But I understand people are more aware and more enlightened after this crisis. But what we have seen after day 2 and day 3 of COP, and the promises, the NDCs which were brought forth by the world leaders, I would very outrightly say they still don't understand the crisis. When we said grows like 2060, 2070, so that you still don't understand the crisis we are in. You still do not have the empathy to understand if a life dies in a family, it impacts the entire family. But the positive thing is all other people are more aware, and I see a very strong hope and fire for action, for climate action around climate justice after this entire pandemic. Coming to your other question regarding how one can strengthen this movement globally and how one can participate, I think it is very required on all of us who can join or connect all these movements. It's our responsibility that we become that connecting points for all these movements who do not have voices, or who do not have resources or proper internet or proper develop that structure to connect to each other. Because it is very required that all these movements which are happening at local level, national level, and transnational level unite as one big force against all these people who are against this planet, who are against us living. So, and all of us has a role to play in connecting those movements. People are fighting everywhere. People are fighting in Burundi, they are fighting in India, they are fighting in France, they're fighting everywhere. But what is required for us is to connect all these people, all these dots, and then fight against all these people. We need to fight locally very strongly and connect globally to everybody, share all these things and give more power to each voices, even the local voices, because that gives us strength, that gives us hope. This person is talking in France about the same issue which I'm facing in India. Mining is happening in India and mining is also happening in Australia. So we have similar issues, we have similar fights. So let's give strength to those fights. We protest on the street, and when I'm protesting on the street against someone who is mining my forest, so it is like, it is empowering even them who are fighting against mining in their own countries, in Australia, in New Zealand, in France, and in all other places. So that is very important, I feel, and that is how all of us have some responsibility to connect in every way and not see the differences, just see the common points, just see the causes that we want to fight for and join together.
Thank you, Snigdha. And Nick, those two questions to you, and then I'll get everyone to wrap up because we're almost at time.
Great. So, look, I mean, I think COVID is you can see it as a microcosm of everything that's wrong with the world and the global economy. And it's also made it worse. It's exacerbated. I mean, inequality has grown massively throughout COVID, right? The very rich, the super rich have made a lot more money. Most people have suffered a lot. And there's people like me who, because our state is wealthy enough, it's kind of protected livelihoods and so on. But for most people in the world, it's been really severe. I mean, just look at the vaccine situation. The other thing I'm really working on at the moment, and I'm about to go off to the WTO, is to fight for vaccine equality, because while people like me are being offered third doses, like some countries haven't even been able to vaccinate their frontline health workers. Why? Because major decisions over our society, over life and death for the last 30, 40 years, dogma has told us, should be handed to the market. The market will sort it out. Well, guess what? What the market does is deliver all of the goods to the people who've got the money to pay for them, and everybody else gets nothing. And that's exactly what you see with vaccine. I mean, it couldn't be clearer, really couldn't be clearer. Some countries have got several times what they need. Other countries have got nothing at all. That's because we left it to the market. And some corporations, by the way, have become phenomenally wealthy. I mean, some of these vaccine producer CEOs have become billionaires. Exactly the same thing as has happened with our food system. As Snigdha talked about earlier, I mean, India's done actually a fantastic job, because the farmers are very strong there, of resisting the neoliberalization and marketization of food. Not completely, of course, but to some degree of resisting a system which, I mean, basically has handed our entire agricultural system globally over to a handful of multinational corporations. And people have got very, very rich from that, and everybody else is dependent upon global markets, which are extremely volatile. I mean, we know this because the British Empire practiced this 200 years ago in India, actually, where people died of famine, not because there was no food, but because the market decided, actually, these people are too poor to be able to afford this food, let's ship it somewhere else. where richer people can enjoy it. So, you know, that we've lived with the consequences of throwing society over to the market for a long time now. It's a disaster, and it creates massive political turbulence through the inequality. I mean, this is why we're seeing social breakdown, the rise of authoritarianism and whatnot elsewhere. Now, how does that feed into the climate justice movement? Well, I think it's a factor. I mean, I think, you know, in a country like Britain and probably many countries around the world, young people are feeling a vulnerability, a fragility about their future that, you know, young people simply didn't feel when I was young. And that, I think, informs the politics and means that big change, really big change on a big scale, becomes something that is in people's interests, is in those people's interests. Right? So you have even relatively well-off young people actually have an interest in fighting alongside workers and the anti-imperialist struggle for the kind of big change that I don't think, by and large, I mean, okay, there were some exceptions, but by and large, young people didn't feel 20 or 30 years ago in rich countries like this. And that, so there's hope there, right? But I don't want to pretend, as Amelia says, I mean, it would be stupid for me to pretend, okay, let's all go home, everything's going to be okay. I mean, you know, that's a very optimistic perspective on the story. But at the same time, this same system is giving rise to conspiracy theories, to eco-fascism, you know, to all sorts of to authoritarianism, to a crackdown to complete, you know, crazy leaders like Bolsonaro and Trump coming to power. So, you know, there's a lot to fear as well. I mean, you know, we've really got to, but I mean, change is here. I mean, I see no way that the system will continue as it currently is. And so what we have to do is push it in a direction where we can ensure more fairness and more equality and less vulnerability. And we can make that offer to people. And I think that's, you know, for me, that's a really, and so, yes, there were some questions about, do we need to get rid of short-termism from the economy? I mean, absolutely. I mean, you know, obviously having an economy which basically says we allow you to do whatever you want, extract whatever you want and throw the cost onto society, onto future generations, onto the global south, doesn't matter. You know, of course, that's, you know, we see the consequences of that before us. Of course, we need that. Of course, we need a different multilateral system that puts, you know, institutions like the World Health Organization above and institutions fighting climate change above institutions that are trying to liberalize trade. So, you know, we need to do all of that, and that's massive. It's just a massive task. But you know, we have very little choice, really. This is the situation we're in, and I think we've got to pull hope where we can. But I think one thing I would like to say that I think we've not been good enough at, although I think there is a very vibrant movement, there is a movement which really gets it and really excites me and enthuses me. I do think like reaching beyond that, beyond people who are already politically active, is really important, and telling them, because, you know, fear is not always a great motivator for progressive change in society. And I think we've got to think about them. And for a society of people who've been told for so long, your worth is about how new your iPhone is. You know, your worth is judged in terms of material objects, and we cannot continue pumping out those material objects. So there is going to be a cost to some of us in the world, but that can be replaced by a society which is just so much nicer and better to live in so many different ways. You know, public transport system which actually works and is cheap and is effective. And you know, you say the same thing about public. We just need to take huge lumps of society outside of the market mechanism, essentially, and run them in a fundamentally different way. And if we can find a language to convince people that that's actually in their interest, then we'll be getting somewhere. And I think we're not quite at that level yet. But as I say, I mean, we have to do all we can to make that the case, because there is no option just to sit back and things will continue like they've continued for the last 20 or 30 years.
Thank you, Nick. We have 1 minute, so I'm going to give each of the other three of you one sentence to give us any final thoughts or reflections, or one little plug for something if you want to, and then I will wrap up and we'll be done. So Snigdha first.
See, what I feel after attending COP, like especially after attending COP and the work we are doing here, that we have like a lot more responsibility than we thought of earlier. And the young people have no other choice but to act on those responsibilities right now, because we are seeing that all those crises in the present is not in the future for us. So we have more responsibilities without any option, and we will act on it.
Thank you. Yeah. And Tracy?
Yes, I'll just base my conclusion on someone who mentioned the market mechanisms, linking those two to COVID and climate. It's something that we are actually discussing during this COP, you know, and like I said earlier, the political arm will continue to control everything, and the more we, you know, having the North shifting to renewables and the developing countries, you know, shifting or possibly pulling back to fossil, you know, it's more on what can I achieve more and who can come with me, you know. Same with what COVID did. How can we twist everyone around? How can we twist everyone's arm to ensure that we can achieve as different countries? So with, I would like to say, unfortunately, with climate change, we still have a lot to do. And you know, the way, if you really understand the politics behind the negotiations, then you know, you understand also the market mechanisms, the economy, the whole twist around. So I look forward to engaging some more with others. I'll put my email address here for those who want to engage further beyond this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. And last word to Amelia.
So I want to end with a message of hope, because I did take a lot of hope from COP, and it wasn't from the politicians, it was from the people who were there speaking out about their experiences in different countries, different continents, different life experiences of the climate emergency and presenting solutions. And it gives me hope because it's people that have changed the course of history. And so it's the speakers on this panel that give me hope. It's the people who, if you've attended this event, you give me hope, because it's by people power that change happens. And we know that the science is asking for nothing less than a systematic change of our world systems, our country systems, our local systems, to ensure that we address inequalities while remaining below 1.5 degrees of warming and tackling the ecological emergency. So I hope you can take that hope and take action, however small that might be, because each person, change happens by people taking small actions, and we can all be part of that.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, Amelia. Thank you to each of our wonderful and lovely panelists. It's been a genuine pleasure to sit with you for the last hour. These events are only possible because we get some donations from our readers and attendees. So if you have some money you can give us, then there's a link which Anita has pasted somewhere in the chat. Thank you to everyone who's commented in the chat. There's been lots of fascinating comments in there. I didn't have time to read out most of them, but they were, you know, I did absorb all of them, and I'm sure our fellow panelists did too. Thank you so much, everyone. That's us past time. So I'm going to say good night and good luck.